We're shaking things up a little bit on today's episode of GAAP Chats. We're hosting our first guest, and we didn't have to look too far to find her. It's our colleague Vicky Hale, Chief Learning Officer of GAAP Dynamics. Chris, Vicky, and I will discuss current learning and development trends for CPA firms by looking at some of the recent training projects that we've been working on with accounting firms of all sizes. We're doing this because, as we've learned over the past 20 plus years, if one firm is doing it, there's a pretty good chance that other firms should be doing it too. As they say, sharing is caring, and we here at GAAP Chats want to share our experiences to help you and your professionals be audit they can be. See what I did there? Welcome to GAAP Chats, the podcast dedicated to all things accounting, brought to you by GAAP Dynamics. I'm your host, Mike Walworth, and with me as always is my faithful partner, Chris Brundrett. We hope you'll join us on our journey today as we share our passion for accounting and help change the way you train. Good morning, Chris. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing good. Exciting time here at GAAP Chats. We're inviting our first guest. It is our colleague, Vicky Hale. Vicky, why don't you say hello to the audience?
Hello, audience. Thanks for having me, Mike and Chris. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. Why don't you, Vicky, before we get started, why don't you just give people a little rundown of your experiences and kind of what you do at GAAP Dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at GAAP Dynamics for 10 years now, and I started as a training specialist, and I've gotten my hands in all the cookie jars here at GAAP Dynamics. So I develop training, facilitate training. I head up our e-learning programming team and just love to dabble in all things learning.
So, Vicky, you have quite a lot of insight into what's going on these days with not only our projects internally, but really what's impacting the audit firms that we work with. And I think that's what we're going to focus a little bit on to start is this idea that there's a renewed focus out there on audit quality. And I know, we've been working on some projects related to audit quality, but we've been hearing a lot out there from our former colleagues that work for audit firms, as well as various audit firms that we talk to at conferences and things like that. So what are you seeing out there, this renewed focus on audit quality? Why is this happening now? And what are firms doing about it?
Yeah, and you know what? I actually might kick it over to Mike. So he brought me on here, so I think I might throw him under the bus first and help me set the tone with how this conversation's going to go. So Mike, maybe I'll kick it off to you to start us off.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think Vicky and Chris, just a disclaimer here, Vicky and Chris both actually do not know what we're going to talk about today. I mean, we certainly have some bullet points, but I will kick us off. And as Chris mentioned, it is this kind of renewed focus on audit quality. And so, I guess, why are we here, I guess? And this is my opinion. And I could do the normal CPA disclaimer, everything I say, it's not to be taken, But I mean, in my opinion, and I want to get y'all's opinion too. In my opinion, we have seen, and because we look at PCAOB inspection reports and of the annual firms that get inspected annually. And we had seen, and we've been doing that for 10 years probably, we had seen them take their pound of flesh out of the Big Four. I mean, Big Four deficiency rates spiked up in some cases, almost 50%. And these firms spent millions, tens of millions of dollars addressing these PCAOB deficiencies. And now I think they were at a point where those deficiency rates for the Big Four are coming down quite substantially, right? I think the last time I looked, I think there's two of them that have in the single digits deficiency rates. Isn't that? I think that's right, Vicky, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So the PCAOB has kind of had their pound of flesh from the Big Four, and then COVID hit, and I don't know about you, Chris. You and I were talking about this earlier, but do you think people took a pause a little bit?
I think the whole world took a pause, and certainly there was a lot of focus on just daily life and other things. And we had the transition to work from home, and then a lot of people coming back into the office, and certainly had a major impact on the audit world, trying to do audits remotely, but also on the PCAOB themselves. I mean, looking at the inspection process, I mean, that certainly changed quite a bit during COVID. So, I feel like we're kind of getting back to, more normal or the new normal now. And we're seeing that might be part of the renewed focus. And Mike, if I might add, you were mentioning about the firms had their, I think you said pound of flesh from the big four, and now they're moving, to outside of the big four. I think another reason for that may be because, we're seeing more PCAOB audits taking place at smaller firms than before. And some of that is because the PCAOB had, such an impact on the big four that, we've seen big four in some cases shedding some of their smaller public companies because of, all of the processes that they have to do and, all of this focus from, the PCAOB that, it's almost like, well, let's maybe shed some of these smaller, less profitable, dare I say, public companies. Well, they still have to be audited. And so we're seeing some smaller firms picking those audits up and getting into the PCAOB space where they may have not been before. And so that's certainly going to catch the eye of the regulators.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Chris, because one of the firms that we recently did an engagement for, they are a top 30 firm, and they want to get bigger. They want to move in the top 25 or top 20. And they are actually actively soliciting PCAOB engagements, which is funny because firms can go either way, right? They can say, nope, I'm not going to do them, or I want more of them. And this firm wanted more of them. And so that sort of, with that, I guess, with the renewed focus by the PCAOB or the would you say the catch the eye of the PCAOB, they're certainly going to come into these, sort of firms that are not the big four. And so the PCAOB inspectors are coming in. But what we're noticing really, and this is 3 top 30 firms in the last month and a half. I mean, this is unprecedented. I mean, GAAP Dynamics, hence the name, we were focused on accounting. And I would say that based on what we're seeing, we as a company have decided that one of our main clients is accounting firms, and they do audits. And so we should probably be in the audit game as well. Now, we've always done an audit update, and we've always done, PCAOB inspection findings and stuff like that. But I think really there's a renewed focus on sort of, like you said, audit quality and audit training. And one of the biggest areas is internal controls and risk assessment. And you know why that is? So, why do you think that is, Chris? Why do you think they're focusing on internal controls and risk assessment?
Well, it's certainly been one of the top areas of PCAOB inspection findings over the years. And so, I think that's part of it. And, as firms are, in my example, gearing up to do PCAOB audits or more PCAOB audits, they really need to focus on that part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, it goes even a step further. So I actually, for one of these firms, I actually had to get my hands dirty again and get up into internal controls. And internal control, understanding the entity, including its internal controls and the risk assessment process accounts for, so the AICPA did a peer review, and 47% of all audits were non-conforming, which means that they weren't in compliance with GAS, mainly because of internal controls and risk assessment. So this has become a huge factor. And so again, I think the important point here is it's not just PCAOB. Peer reviewers are also getting into this. And in, the old days of, I don't know, Chris, I don't know if you remember this. Vicky's a little younger than us, so she don't remember. But accounting has had peer review since before us even.
Sure.
But it always used to be kind of, and I don't want to disparage the profession, but it was a little bit like, hey, I'm going to review your audit. I'm going to tell you some things that are like glaring, instances, but I'm not going to bust you too much because I know then you're going to bust me. And so it was I'll scratch your back, you kind of scratch mine sort of thing. Well, the PCAOB turned that on its head, right? I mean, they said, listen, we're going to do a regular inspection, and if it's deficient, it's deficient.
Well,
but peer reviewers are catching the memo now.
I certainly, don't think there was ever any, malicious intent, right?
No.
I mean, we're not saying that, but just by its nature, the peer review program, wasn't super independent because, and especially as you had consolidation of the bigger firms over the years. I mean, it was Big 8 and, now we're down to Big 4. So, it really becomes a less independent group. So, the PCAOB being around now for, 20 years at this point, right? Or more, it's, that is truly an independent organization. to provide these types of inspections. So now that this is interesting, we've talked about PCOB, we've talked about peer review. Mike, what is your, what I know we've been talking a lot about, outside of the United States and some of the rules on an international level, this idea of ISQM. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's the International Standards of Quality Management, and I got to take a step back because now that I've gotten into gas, in other words, one of the main C-suite people have gotten back into audit, Chris, hint, hint. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to, dog you there. But anyway, as I've gotten back into audit, I've realized that the international standards on auditing and generally accepted auditing standards are more or less converged now, which is good news for us, Vicky, by the way, because that means we're not going to have a international audit library and a U.S. audit library. We don't need that anymore. We can just have one audit library.
And we love that efficiency.
I think you're going to need some stuff for PCOB. That needs to be extra, right? Because PCOB has extra stuff in it. But generally speaking, to answer your question, Chris, the IAASB and the Accounting Standards Board, which is an arm of the AICPA, have really kind of come together and converged all the old standards, and any new standards that come out are converged. And one of those things, this International Standard on Quality Management, this ISQM, basically, if I had to describe it, I would say it's going to be like SOX was for public companies, right? The internal control, like accounting firms need to have internal controls and quality management in place to make sure that they're doing quality audits. Now, ISQM is effective now, I believe, for international companies. And so international accounting firms are having to comply with that now. We have a similar standard in the United States, the SQMS, Standards of Quality Management System or whatever. That's applicable for audits ending on or after December 15th, 2025, I think. Okay, so the audit firms in the United States have a few years to get their quote unquote houses in order. And one of the things we're seeing is, and these companies are coming to us, I think that's a big reason why we're getting this, tremendous influx in wanting auditing training, because they're trying to figure out, like, oh my gosh, this is going to be one more thing that the PCOB and peer reviewers will make sure we have in place. And that inevitably means training. I think all the inspectors are saying, listen, your people need to understand the rules of the audit and the rules of the applicable accounting framework, which is GAAP.
And there needs to be proof or a record that there has been, proper and official training that's taken place. Now, you mentioned ISQM, or I asked you about ISQM, and that has impacts all the way across the firm from a quality control perspective, as you mentioned, but it trickles all the way down. I mean, we're in the training world, and our clients, the learning and development departments at our clients are also having to deal with ISQM when it comes to training. I mean, there's certain parameters around training and review of training materials and things like that. So this is pretty extensive stuff. And it impacts, the firm in many, many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like one of the one we just did this year, right? It's a member. It's been a long time client, member firm of a Big Four network that we've done for years, and they actually required us to review our training materials to make sure, and it was all related to ISQM.
Right.
Review
our training materials, something we'd never done before, right? No, I'm just kidding.
We review it internally. No, time out. We review them internally, and we're all CPAs, and we have to follow the NASBA process.
Right.
But they had their professional development department had to review our training materials to give them the quote unquote blessing.
Sure. And that was great. I mean, it's always great to have another set of eyes on things that people come from a different perspective. So
yeah, definitely. So that's the first trend is this is renewed focus on audit quality, renewed focus on audit training. And like I said, there's been at least 4 firms in the past, 6 weeks that have kind of come to us about that, and I expect many more. So we have this special guest here, Chris, with us. Vicky's like, why the heck am I here? Right. So Vicky, I'm going to ask you, what's a trend in L&D, learning and development for accounting firms that you're sort of noticing or that you want to alert to our listeners?
Yeah, so if I think about it kind of holistically first, I think the biggest thing I notice a shift in over the past few years is the modalities by which training firms are offering training. So if I think about how our company started and how we existed pre-pandemic, it was almost all live classroom training. Nobody knew so many different webinar platforms existed. People were just beginning to dabble in e-learning, but it wasn't a big deal. Everything was pretty much classroom-based. and you brought everybody together for these big week-long boondoggles, etc. Obviously, when the pandemic hit, that shut down fast, and people had to find a way to still get their learners, their auditors, the CPEs that they needed to maintain their accreditation. And so everyone quickly shifted and jumped on the webinar bandwagon that we all now probably love so dearly. And so I think now what I see is most people expected that we would shift back into the classroom post-pandemic. But as we're talking to our clients and our prospective clients, and we're asking, what is your current training environment? We're seeing that shift just quite simply isn't happening. If anything, what we're seeing is more variety in the ways that training is being offered. So you might see some classroom training if it strategically makes sense. But more often than not, what you're going to see is that most accounting firms have really embraced this new world of online training, and especially live training via webinars, and even a little bit more into this e-learning realm.
Yeah, I got a question for Chris first. Chris, okay, do you like going out in the classroom?
I love it. I mean, it's one of the reasons I joined this company 17 years ago. And, as Vicky said, that's predominantly what we used to do. Thankfully, we're getting back into it. I mean, we are doing some classrooms, so I get to do
year,
that.
Like,
but
how much have we got? I mean, is it back to normal for us?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
Okay.
not. I mean, there were years where we did, 500 plus training days, out on the road. Obviously not me. That's more days that are in a year. But, I think this year we probably did, if I had to guess, less than 20 days in the classroom.
Wow.
We definitely have seen a longer term effect, I think, of COVID and the shift to webinars. And that's okay. I love doing webinars as well. And, it is convenient, and you don't have the travel. I mean, as the instructor, you don't have the travel to worry about, but you don't have to bring people together. It's been very convenient for, companies or firms that have people spread out, in different areas. It's convenience to bring people together virtually, and also cost savings. I mean, let's face it, flying everybody in for a boondoggle at a hotel and a training costs a lot of money. So what we're seeing, though, with some clients is kind of a combined approach, because there is value in that classroom environment. You do get not only the true in-person interaction, but you also get the ability to network. And for a lot of companies and firms, it's the after-class activities that are really important to them. So I think going forward, we're going to see kind of a hybrid approach. Maybe for cost savings for some trainings, we'll do webinars, and then, maybe do some strategic, I'll say, in classroom training. So, it's been kind of an interesting trend as we've come out of COVID, or are coming out of COVID.
So much CPE, so little time. With over 100 unique e-learning courses and even more hours of CPE available, GAAP Dynamics learning platform, The Revolution, has you covered. Do you want CPE-eligible customized training for your team with live in-person instruction or live webinars? That's cool too. You can visit our website, gapdynamics.com. That's GAP with 2 A's to learn more today. Looking for our full catalog of e-learning courses? Check out revolution.gapdynamics.com and get ready to change the way you train.
Now, Vicky, we talk about, Chris we've talked about webinars and live training, and, webinars I think are here to stay. I mean, the other thing I just realized as you were talking, Chris, I hadn't even thought about this, but webinars by their nature are chunkable, because there's no way you can have a webinar. I mean, we do more than 2-hour webinar is just a no-go, right? I mean, so people, if you're listening to me, if you're planning a webinar, it needs to be like an hour and a half max, really. Anything more is just, you're going to get multitasking and such. But we've talked about those two, Vicky, but, we have a third quote unquote modality as well, and that's e-learning. And I guess, you had an interesting conversation with a Big Four firm regarding live or, classroom training versus e-learning versus whatever. And what did that firm tell you, right? They were going to What were they going to do? Like,
Yeah. So, I mean, you've got to think about the scenarios that your people are in. So, a lot of firms still have people that are working remotely and can't come together maybe for live classroom training for some of the reasons that Chris has talked about, or aren't comfortable being in that live setting yet. And so, for some scenarios, you need to be able to accommodate both types of people because there is value in both types of training. So, some firms will have the same content offered kind of dual modalities. So there is a live option, but there's also this kind of self-paced e-learning version available too for those who can't attend live or are working in a different way that makes more sense for them. Also, there's kind of like a fourth way out there too, this blended learning, which I think is what we'll really see as we move forward. So thinking about how people live and work now, and also what the best way is to offer that content you're trying to teach. So some of the firms we work with will actually take some of the e-learning courses that in nature tend to be a bit more basic in terms of the structure of their content, and have their learners take that at their own time when it's convenient to them, and then save that live training that is a little bit more costly. It is more interactive for when you're talking about more complex issues. So, okay, you've now reviewed the basics of fair value. Let's now shift to this conversation. How do we audit this estimate? And we can get into, a more structured conversation there.
Yeah, one of the things, Chris, he's raising his hand via Zoom.
Okay, yes. I thought I'd have Chris. Some fun here, right?
Okay, go ahead.
All right. So, but as Vicky was talking, and I was sort of reflecting, there's actually two projects that we're currently working on that I think really highlight these trends, right? The trends that Mike brought up, as well as what Vicky's bringing up. So one is for a large member firm of a Big Four, and it's audit training. It's audit training for new hires up through, their third year with the firm. And it's being done virtually via webinar. And to your point, Mike, of not having webinars too long, they meet in the webinar platform, and then they go off and they do group work or self work, and then they come back. And so while it's a whole day, they've got sort of the mixed modality that you were mentioning, Vicky, to kind of keep these short. We discussed with them whether they were going to go back to live. The reason they went to this webinar-based format was COVID. As we mentioned, it used to be live training. Well, guess what? They have so many people that they have to train across a pretty wide geographic area that they can't possibly do it live. They could not train that many people in the time frame that they need to train them by going back to the live. So it's kind of interesting. We always expected it to go back, but this is truly a constraint of time that's causing this issue. And then, another one, which is really a development project that we're working on. This last one we're helping facilitate. This is development. To your point, Vicky, it's a future program for a Big Four firm, but it's totally mixed modality. There's e-learning components for the basics. This is industry specific training. So but the basic part of it, there's an e-learning component, then a live component for some of the more, detailed and nuanced stuff. And then there's going to be a webinar component too for some sort of add-ons and things like that. So it's just, to me, I'm training accounting nerd, I guess, if you will, but it's just sort of fascinating to see how things have evolved, forced by COVID, but now evolving because we've sort of seen the light of other, ways of doing training.
Yeah. And I will say, for anybody who's listening, who's thinking, well, great, we'll just get rid of classroom training altogether. I have heard from some firms that they're starting to bring it back in certain circumstances. For instance, if you've got, associates who started a few years ago, they might not even have met the rest of their teammates yet because they could have been all remote. So in some strategic instances, you're actually seeing a shift back into the classroom very purposefully so that you can make those human connections.
And I have a comment. So I'm going to come back to you, Chris, and your trend because, whatever. But I have questions for both of you. But to your point, Vicky, very good friend of ours, former Big Four, colleague of ours. He's raised the second generation of accountants, and his daughter started with a Big Four firm. She's been there 6 months, 9 months now. Hasn't even been in the office once. My brother, who works for a Fortune 500 company here, one of his colleagues has a daughter working for a different Big Four firm here in town. She also hadn't been in the office and was being sort of body shopped to other firms, right? To just work versus she never met her teammates. This is what you were saying, Vicky. Guess what? Both of them are considering quitting. So if it were me, I know you have this. Do we get back in the office? Do we not? I'm telling you, these young kids, they ain't scared of the virus. In my personal opinion, you need to get back in the office because you're going to lose all those people or a lot of the people that, now again, we can talk about blended approach there too, right? I mean, this idea of work from home some, work from where you're most efficient. I got it. But these kids, if you think about our big four careers, guys, what would we have been if we'd have been sitting at home every day? You wouldn't learn. What I learned being with the partner. I learned being with the manager. So that's my first sort of take on this, home. And like you said it yourself, Vicky, they're purposely trying to bring people back together again. And so I think that is sort of indicative of kind of what I'm saying. Now, Chris, on yours, I got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You had talked about these two projects, and I'm going to focus on the one where they're doing this audit training, and they try to train all these massive people. My question for you is, why audit training typically has been an internal thing? So if I think back at my days at KPMG, the audit methodology training was done by KPMG employees. Like, why is this big four firm or member firm of a big four network? Why are they hiring us? Like, what's going on? Do they not have the staff or what?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, there's staffing issues. Number one, because of turnover, the Great Resignation. We've all heard about it. We've read about it. I don't think we need to tell our podcast listeners what that all is all about. But, certainly coming out of COVID, when the Great Resignation started, that created an issue for this firm. They were losing some of the seasoned or people with experience that could teach these courses, but also cost and reliability. And what I mean by that is the cost of using an internal person. You think about at an audit firm, taking them out of revenue producing work. And, especially when there's a limited number of people, because you do have constraints on resources, it doesn't make sense from a cost perspective. While, it actually in the long run becomes cheaper to hire someone from the outside. The other issue is reliability. And I'm certainly not trying to be critical of the people, but, a lot of time we've seen this with all of our clients. And this is, for years pre-COVID, this has always been an issue. Where if you have people that are normally in the field, audit professionals, and you designate them to do some training, oftentimes they get pulled back into the field, right? They're on a job, it's taking longer than they expected. There's a crisis at a client. The client does a transaction of some sort. The partner doesn't want them to leave anymore. And so they get pulled at the last minute. That creates a real issue for the L&D people, right? Because they've scheduled the training. It needs to happen, and they don't have someone there. So, that's the other reason why they're looking outside is that element of consistency and reliability. Now, to round out with this project, it's actually a combined approach. It's someone from our team that's the constant, but then there are people from the field that are co-instructing, but there's at least one person that will always be there no matter what happens. So it's kind of a neat combined approach that we're doing there, and you get some of the professional training experience along with the real world experience, and that makes for a pretty cool model.
Well, yeah, and that co-facilitation model sort of helps with the firm's own methodology and the firm's own technology and resources to sort of make sure that they have a firm voice there along with our voice. And so if you're thinking about any trend, that co-facilitation model does work well. Mm-hmm. Last topic, Vicky. I know there's one that you wanted to talk about, and it's not a trend for CPA firms. It is a trend for CPA firms, but it's a trend for all companies that do training. And it's this idea of accessibility. What are we talking about here? So, like, if you can just talk to us a little bit about accessibility and then what you're seeing out there in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we do a lot to try to keep up with L&D trends in the virtual space because we do a lot of virtual training. And so, In accounting, maybe it hasn't picked up as much traction, although certainly with the big four firms it has. But as you look holistically across the L&D community, the hot buzzword right now is really going to be accessibility. And, that can sound probably a little scarier than it in fact is in practice. But it's really just making sure that as you are designing training and facilitating training, you think about the kind of people who are going to be consuming that. And so there can be it can run the gamut really in terms of how much change you're willing to invest in what you're doing currently to make things more accessible. But even if you think about this podcast right now, if all we were to do was just record this audio, it is only going to be accessible by somebody who is hearing enabled. If you can't hear, you can't listen to this podcast because all we're doing is recording voice. However, we can transcribe that audio, which we do, and make it available as a hyperlink on the page where we host this podcast. And now it's accessible by a larger audience. So, that applies to really all of the training that we do. And there's some changes that you can make that are very simple, looking at the contrast between colors, so you don't want red text on a gray background. It's not going to be readable by somebody who might be red-green colorblind or something like that. They won't be able to make that distinction. Thinking about how people navigate in an e-learning. There's certain activities like drag and drops. Drag this into the right bucket. Well, that's really something that only a sighted person is able to truly do. If you're navigating with a keyboard, there's no way for you to click that element to be able to drag it and drop it in the right bucket. So you might have to design that element differently.
And Vicky, so are you seeing, so we know it's a trend, and certainly we go to DevLearn, every year, and this was a big trend there, but are companies starting to, because it actually is starts from the design, right? Not only design, but develop it with accessibility in mind. So maybe you can explain a little bit how some companies are dealing with this to try to make their e-learning more accessible.
Yeah, sure. So, I guess, first of all, it depends on who you are. So if you work for, a government agency or something like that, this is something that's been required for quite some time. But accounting firms are probably just getting up to speed on accessibility rules and requirements. Most of the big firms now are pushing to make all of their materials 508 compliant, which is sort of the bar that you seek to achieve if you're trying to make things truly accessible. Not a requirement at this time, but just something to think about. So, for most of us, what this means is looking at the colors that we're using, the combination of colors, even if it's just in a PowerPoint, thinking about text color, box colors, background colors, things like that. There's online checkers that you can use and enter in the color of the font, enter in the color of the background, and it'll tell you, is this sufficient for someone to be able to read if they have visual problems? And quite honestly, as some of us are getting a little older, it's easy to see that just naturally. I can look at something and say that font is too small or that color doesn't work well with that other color. So that's an easy change that you can make. Another thing, if you're in more of an e-learning space, is thinking about the ordering of the elements on the slide. So knowing how most people will kind of navigate through a course inherently using a tab key if they're navigating with a keyboard or with the arrows. Or something that we've done for another client who maybe wants their courses to be truly accessible, but maybe not in a true e-learning course, so we can still keep some of those elements like a drag and drop. We create what we've termed as an accessible course index. So it's really a PDF document that is readable by a screen reader, and it takes you through all of the content and interactions of the course, but obviously in a different way than a traditional e-learning would. So this would be, for a non-sighted person to navigate with a screen reader, but they can still answer all the questions, complete the post-course assessment, get their certificates. And to be honest, it's a great resource for a sighted person too, because it's a PDF you can then attach with the e-learning, and they've got all the content to take with them as they go.
And then I know that there's a lot of technology too. Like, so we use Storyline, Articulate Storyline, and I think newest Storyline sort of has accessibility in mind. Is that true?
Absolutely, yeah. They've made a lot of advancements in the past few years. So if you're somebody who creates e-learning in-house or contracts with vendors to get access to accounting e-learning, definitely be aware of that. There's been a lot of changes. Push back on your vendors and look at your own products and see what updates have been made that'll enable you to think better about the other people who are using your training.
Yeah. So last question. I know Chris he's doing like motions on the video here, like wrap it up, and we will, I promise. Last question. I'm going to answer the question for you, but the first question is GAAP Dynamics e-learning accessible? Not yet, but we are going to talk about that, aren't we? What plans do we have, I guess, regarding accessibility?
Yeah. So one of our digital learning specialists, Patrice, has been doing a lot of research on accessibility, and she's got a whole suite of suggestions on how we can improve our e-learning going forward. So we'll definitely be implementing more of those changes in our audit training we're about to release, and all the new IFRS courses we'll be adding to our library.
Awesome. Well, Vicky, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll have to have you back. Chris, I know you had your doubts about this podcast. Are you okay with how it turned out?
I think hopefully, well, I will leave that up to our listeners, Mike.
Yeah.
No.
All right. Well, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Absolutely. And thank you, Vicky, for being here. That is all for this episode of GAAP Chats, your source for all things accounting. Notes and resources from today's episode are linked in the description. And as always, you can find us online at gapdynamics.com and at GAAP Dynamics across social media. It's never too late to become a Gapologist. Head over to our website, subscribe to our blog so that you are the first to know what's new with GAAP Dynamics.